Welcome to Season 3, Episode 3 of the Database Podcast. I'm Dr. Molly Stewart, Director of Research and Analytics Services at Education Analytics, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Vice President of Interoperability Solutions, Rosh Dhanawade. We work with school districts on interoperability and data quality using the EdFi data standard, and through this work, we have come to realize that there are at least 3 different languages being spoken by people working in this space. The language of databases and code, the language of teaching, learning, and educational leadership, and the language of research, including data science and statistics. This podcast aims to bridge the gaps among those 3 general areas because the more we understand how each group conceptualizes data-related topics, the more progress we can make towards solutions for educators and students that fully take advantage of best practices and cutting-edge knowledge in each of these fields of work.
And today we also welcome our guest, Cloud Engineer Manager Eshara Mondal. Eshara and I are both here to discuss the journey of creating and managing an education analytics product called StartingBlocks. StartingBlocks is the open source operational data store product that we use to host EdFi. And without further ado, we'll just jump into our questions. Hi, Eshara.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So we always like to start with a question about how you came to your current work. So if you want to speak a little bit about your background and what kind of journey brought you to EdFi work, that would be awesome to start out with.
Yeah, so I feel like I probably don't have a very traditional path here. So I studied as an undergrad, I studied neuroscience, thinking that I would go into kind of like neuroscience research. But actually, one of my main goals was to actually start traveling. So in order to do that, you need quite a bit of money. And neuroscience research did not pay so well at the time. Maybe now that's different. Um, but I had a friend that was working as an IT consultant, and he had told me about this job as a data analyst, as a business analyst there. And I saw the pay and I was like, okay, if I want to go traveling, I will do that. So I took up a job at a IT consulting company, and we did a lot of data analytics for kind of bigger organizations, so not in education just yet. Um, and it's there that I kind of really got the understanding that data drives a lot of the decisions that happen at a kind of higher level for a lot of organizations, not just education, but literally any industry sector you can think of. There is a component of data-driven decision making. So I found that to be really powerful. And I thought to myself, how can I actually get into this kind of line of work permanently? So I got up my startup funding to go traveling. I quit my job and I went traveling. And then when I came back to the States, I really wanted to apply the knowledge that I had gained from my previous position as an IT consultant into something that I felt was a little bit more, I guess, mission driven and more focused on just improving society as a whole. And my previous position was more about kind of like database, like SQL analysis and things like that. So I think I literally looked up in LinkedIn education analytics because I wanted to work in the education sector. And I found an opening for a database developer at Education Analytics. So I applied and thankfully they accepted me. So here I am. But I remember, I think within my first couple of months at EA, I had been invited to go to an EdFi Tech conference. And that's when I was introduced to this whole EdFi concept. And ever since then, I've kind of been indoctrinated and learning and kind of growing with the EdFi ecosystem. And getting to produce something like StartingBlocks has been really great to see personally my journey from, what is an API to here's like a full-fledged product that we can contribute back to the community and also our organization's understanding of EdFi. I've kind of been here for probably close to 6 years now. So, yeah, lots of growing and lots of learning through that journey.
So I have a follow-up question on that. Considering the timing of how long you've been at EA, you would have seen the transition from primarily non-EdFi data to EdFi data. Can you talk a little bit about that transition and maybe thinking about, what leading up to what we're going to be talking about with starting blocks?
Yeah. So the I think when our organization first learned of EdFi, we did a lot of, uh, I think we saw the benefit of it very quickly, because EA has its roots in kind of analytics services and kind of useful data products for education agencies. Um, a lot of that, if anybody has involvement with data analytics at all, one of the biggest pains is like kind of cleaning that data that you get and um, kind of coalescing the data that you get in such a way that you can even get it to a state that you can then perform analytics on. So I think when education analytics learned, so EA learned of EdFi, we kind of immediately saw the benefit of it. Um, but that being said, it's easy to see the benefit of something, but it is actually hard to put it into practice. I think there's definitely a lot of wishful thinking in the sense that, like, okay, if you get the data in an EdFi kind of compliant data model, we could do some really cool things off of that data and really quickly. But getting that data to that kind of shape, the EdFi data model shape, is a whole process in it of itself. And I think we had a good understanding of like, okay, there's going to be some growing pains for us and for all of our partners in kind of migrating to this new way of thinking about transferring data. But I don't know that any of us actually thought of uh, probably the scale at which that would occur. So I think it's definitely been very interesting to see. It's not just our organization that needs to be on the same page internally, but we also need to get our partners on the same page. And get sometimes it's harder to get our partners on the same page because they've been doing something for such a long time in a certain way. To see the benefit in this kind of new direction, kind of takes a bit of prodding and poking.
Rosh, did you have a follow-up question?
Well, I just had a comment because
Yeah.
that same feeling of we see the promise, but then we then embark on a journey that is completely undefined. It was a very similar journey that Molly and I have both been on, where at the very start, when we were introduced to EdFi as well, it was very much promise driven and uh, let's say outcome focused, but not process focused. And so we were in a same scenario where we saw, yeah, we understand the promise and the vision of where this is coming from, but then had to actually put the journey together and to start figuring out and then learning things that hadn't already been learned by other people before, which is an odd place to be, especially when you're a technologist and you're used to seeing patterns repeat and then those patterns evolve and change over time. But largely playbooks are in place and you kind of go through a process of figuring things out, especially if you're in a position like I was as just a programmer. But when we started doing this EdFi work, it was the same thing. We saw the promise, we saw an ability to be able to deliver more value to educators, but then had no real understanding till we got into it of the amount of changes necessary at the district level, the vendor level, like you alluded to, Eshara, or even on our side, on the implementation side, how many changes are necessary to the infrastructure in order to meet the needs of those two other parties. And so there's this interesting mix of learning as you go. And we've heard this phrase more often than I think I'm comfortable with in the field. Is like we're building the airplane as we go, and that feeling has still not completely gone away because so much of it is still figuring things out and getting things to the point where the data model has the things that you need, the technology is in a place where it's meeting some of the field needs. So wanted to echo what Eshara was saying in that this is not a foreign concept because I think we've all, if you're listening to this and you've been in EdFi world for a while, you've probably had a similar experience of you got the vision, but then as soon as you started to hit the ground, you're not into a full sprint. You're definitely plodding through like heavy snow to get to the point where you start to see results.
It's that whole devil in the details kind of mentality.
So, kind of building on that and thinking about still the history, um, can you tell us, like, I think a lot of people who are listening are probably familiar with the concept of an EdFi ODS, an API, and EA's specific like branding of that is StartingBlocks, but it's you guys use it in a kind of specific way. So, can you tell us like why did you choose to go that route and what is it exactly and any lessons learned along the way? I'm sure there are.
Oh yeah, sure. So at a really high level, StartingBlocks is essentially an infrastructure as code base. So it's all encoded in CloudFormation templates. And it is a way to provision the EdFi API and ODS using AWS cloud resources. Um, so that is at a really high level of what it is. And we specifically chose AWS because it is kind of just a monster of a cloud provider. So these templates, CloudFormation templates that I mentioned, the StartingBlocks code base, can only be deployed in AWS, so can't be deployed in Azure or Google Cloud. And we kind of consciously chose this route because AWS has the market share in cloud hosting, but also the ability to do some really cool stuff with development tooling, developer tooling and developer experience is just kind of unmatched. In AWS, there's like a whole ecosystem of developer tooling that you could use. Whereas in other ecosystems in Google Cloud and Azure, it's kind of still developing. So that's why we chose the AWS route. And we kind of also went the route of doing it as a cloud hosted deployment because we quickly saw the need for it to be a scalable solution, a highly available solution, and something. So when we go to education agencies and we're tell them, hey, if you give us your data in an EdFi compliant data structure, right, something that aligns with EdFi, we're kind of assuming that they have the ability to, one, they have the hardware available to deploy the EdFi API ODS, and two, that they have kind of the staff available to manage and maintain and administer and keep that hardware and software up to date. If we deploy it in the cloud, a lot of that is kind of abstracted. So the underlying hardware is kind of taken care of, and then some of the updates to that hardware that you would do if it was on-prem is taken care of also with AWS. So that is why we decided to do it as a cloud deployment. And as a StartingBlocks product, we kind of have the in-house expertise to understand EdFi in a way that, that now becomes our bread and butter. And a district or an education agency, they're they don't need to traverse into kind of like into a domain that they're not necessarily an expert in, or maybe they shouldn't even be an expert in. Their expertise and their focus should be on their student population, what serves their students the best. And us at Education Analytics, we can really focus in and get to a point where we are kind of the experts in EdFi, and we can be a trusted source for folks to use our starting blocks templates and know that they're going to be up to date in the technical components that get deployed in AWS, but also just the software itself. So this is kind of the genesis of starting blocks, I think, is to kind of abstract away the complexity of needing to deploy something on premises and then growing the capacity in-house to then be the administrators, managers, and understanding a piece of technology that might not be within the wheelhouse of an education agency. So that's why we kind of created starting blocks.
Sure. Can you go into more detail about the kinds of things that are abstracted away from the partner by using starting blocks as their edfi hosting option? In that, like, what are some functions and skill sets that EA is able to supplement that would maybe take away from the resourcing that you've mentioned, which is like focus on the local, on the students, on the local services? Is there like some set of tangible things that you can point at in what starting blocks offsets from a district that is valuable for somebody to have in using a data system like this, but then also requires a high degree of quality and sophistication?
Yeah. So there, I think there are kind of two layers to that. So the first layer being the AWS infrastructure itself. There is a whole domain of knowledge, of deep, deep knowledge for things like system administrators that you kind of have to have your pulse on, and you have to be an expert in that domain in order to run hardware in a scalable and highly available manner such that it's also secure. So that is kind of one layer. And then the next layer on top of that is understanding EdFi as a service and as a software itself. Both of these things are also kind of moving targets in the sense that they're always evolving, they're always changing. So you really need somebody or a team of folks who kind of has their finger on the pulse of both of these aspects and are experts, deep experts in both of these aspects, such that when you deploy something like a starting blocks environment, um, the people, the maintainers of that code base have a really good understanding of things like, what image are you deploying to an AWS EC2 instance? And does it have the components, and does it have the framework? Does it have the runtime that you need to actually deploy the EdFi API ODS? So there's a lot of configuration that has to happen on the hardware level such that EdFi can actually even run in the first place. So that's like one entire layer that is abstracted away when somebody is deploying starting blocks. And then there's another layer there where the EdFi API and ODS as a set of software is also evolving as a code base itself. And so you really need to understand, how does EdFi work on a Linux system versus a Windows system? What does the backend look like? Is it a Microsoft SQL Server backend and Postgres, or a Postgres backend? And what is, there's also a cost offset for both of those options. So it's diving into kind of a domain that it could be interesting for a lot of folks to dive into, but the depth there is just, it is kind of endless. And because it's always evolving, there's just always the next thing to be thinking about when, a new EdFi version comes out, or perhaps a new image comes out that you need to configure in order to run EdFi. So there's a lot of really nitty-gritty technical things, technical details that one can not need to worry about if they deploy starting blocks in an AWS hosted environment, because a lot of this stuff is stuff that people who are experts in those domains with depth have thought about and have kind of enshrined in these templates.
Yeah, as I think about how much the pace of edfi changes has accelerated over really in the last like 3.5, 4 years compared to like the 6, 7 years prior to that. There are just many changes that come along each year that require the Starting Blocks product team to do some one forward thinking by engaging in these changes before they come out in an official release. But then once they're out in an official release, there is the matter of how do we deploy this in a way that keeps the stability and security that's already in place for existing partners, but then also are we addressing things like cost efficiency, in addition to stability and security? And all of those things require human time to dedicate to. And it can't just be a part of somebody's job because of the depth of, and really the depth and breadth of student data that can come in through edfi. You have to have this holistic approach. Otherwise, there is that you introduce risks into the system, and there's always risk. But when you are lifting massive amounts of data and data that is sensitive and also data that is valuable to negative actors, you have to have that attention to detail. So whether you're using starting blocks or you're deciding to deploy it yourself or use another managed service provider, that's an important thing to consider, is that you are not just deploying a data system that replicates your data, you're also adding another surface that has risks associated with it. And while there are many people in the community and also the EdFi Alliance themselves working very hard to secure the system, there's also lots of configurable options that could introduce risk that are that require serious consideration. And then also separately from that, when we think about why AWS, and Eshara, you mentioned this earlier in your responses, but one thing that has changed significantly over the past 7 years is really the equation for using cloud hosted services rather than deploying things on-prem. So when we were at IU, one of the major reasons why we even started that project was because the university data center offered us the ability to host on their infrastructure within the university data center, and do that at a much lower cost than the districts that were deploying it themselves. And when we compared the cost to AWS at that time, the costs were at least 5x what the university hosting costs were. And now the costs are about equivalent, and in some cases, even cheaper to run in AWS. And so not only are you getting value for your investment, you're also tapping into best of class utilities. And AWS's entire existence is to provide these services, and they have an incentive to make sure that they are secure. There's always updates, there's always security bulletins, etc., that are being addressed, and no infrastructure is ever going to be perfect. But because the costs are now on par, there's just a lot of value in making a serious consideration for cloud hosting your edfi infrastructure, because not only do you get the benefits of a best in class cloud environment, but you also have less of a cost equation that is incented towards like locally hosting or self-hosting. And we've seen a lot of movement in the last year of long-standing projects that have made this transition from self-hosted to now migrating over to the cloud, or or doing RFQs to examine what that process could look like, et cetera. So it's been an interesting journey to see how, if we were having this conversation a few years ago, I would definitely be saying to Eshara, well, all that comes with a cost and all that comes with a premium. But being on the other side of it now and having seen the evolution of the cloud services and the costs in that domain, there's definitely a much more compelling conversation to be had there, especially if you are considering costs, and which most of us are considering costs on a regular basis.
Yeah, and if you get truly into the expertise of cloud engineering, you can get to a point where your architecture that you're deploying is so cost efficient that there's really no incentive to do locally hosting things, because you understand the pricing, you understand the architecture, and you understand what your cloud provider is offering. But yeah, that's a whole other domain, I guess.
So we have just, throughout the last couple of years heard um, concerns from different people about hosting in the cloud versus on-prem in terms of security. Can you speak to, I'm sure I know that EA always has security at top of mind. So, can you speak to that concern and from your experience, maybe lay out, what is there to be concerned about and what is not a concern at this point?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the security concerns at an infrastructure level can be accounted for if you have a good architect, one, which we do. Our principal engineer, Mark Tenhor, is just really great at what he does. So he understands the whole ecosystem really well. Um, but it's not just that, it's kind of transferring that knowledge to all of the engineers on your team who are contributing to the code base, to make sure, hey, don't, at a very, very basic level, like, don't provide any sensitive information in your pull requests to GitHub, right? So that's like at a very basic level. And then you also have the tooling from AWS that allows you at an infrastructure level to like encrypt your data and all that stuff. So I would say from an infrastructure perspective, it's, I think for the most part, obviously it's not ever 100%, I don't think, because we're in such an evolving sector, right? It's always changing. But from an infrastructure perspective, you can trust that your data is being, so it's isolated. We have separate AWS accounts for each of our StartingBlocks partners. It's always owned by the partners. So if they ever ask to, if they ever ask for their data, they want to stop their partnership with EA, we can always provide that data back to them. And all of the tooling that we can use from AWS to encrypt that data, make sure it's encrypted in transit and at rest, we're taking advantage of. I think a lot of the data security then kind of, so on the one side you have, it's like kind of two sides of the same coin. On one side you have all the technical components that you can use to make sure the data that you have stored securely, it's being transferred securely, all that stuff. But then on the other side you have, the humans that interact with that infrastructure. And I think the biggest, I guess I will say concern, even though I feel like concern is a very strong word for this. But I think anybody who's interacting with the infrastructure really has to have a very good understanding of the data model and the security model that Ed5 provides. And Ed5 provides access to the data using API key and secret. So you generate a key and secret for an integrating application, whether or not that's a human at the other end or a system. And you ascribe a security model called a claim set to that key and secret. And if that claim set isn't configured correctly, or if that application isn't configured correctly, there is definitely possibility for data to be transferred that is unintended, right? So I think one of the biggest things that we try to harp is education, in the sense that anybody who interacts and has the ability to create these keys and secrets, or has the ability to create claim sets, needs to have a really good understanding of the different security aspects that EdFi provides, such that when they're creating an application or when they're creating a claim set, they know exactly the resources that they're giving access to, and they're in what capacity. So is it all the data in that resource? Is it part data in that resource? So it's kind of two sides. So there's the technical aspect, and in some ways, the technical aspect is a lot easier to kind of manage and understand. And then on the other side of the coin, you have the human aspect, which humans are fun. We're all very fun to
That's
be
always
around.
the way it is, isn't it?
But it's
Technology
always,
is easier than humans.
yeah, right, right. So I think that is kind of the the more, I guess I will say, concerning again, though I don't think it's like the greatest word for it. But that's kind of the side that I worry about the most, is making sure that all the humans involved know what they're doing, why they're doing it, and being very intentional about the way that they interact with EdFi.
It takes a long time to get there too. Even after all of us, we have a lot of shared and tenured experience on the EA side and within the EdFi community on this particular note. We're always discovering new ways in which we have to re-examine our understanding of this. One example very recently is that we are entering an environment where there are many more vendors that are interacting with EdFi today than even a year ago, and definitely certainly more than 5 years ago when we started this work. And with every new vendor that comes on board, there is a new consideration for how is this vendor interacting with the data? How are they, what is their knowledge of the EdFi API, APIs in general, security models? How do they store their data? So there is an element of this, which is we can secure our side of the equation and we can put tighter controls on it. But as soon as that data leaves, we now have to consider what's happening on the vendor side as well. And so that's another part of the equation where having the one of the benefits that I've seen from just the implementation side with EdFi and StartingBlocks is the ability to use cloud services to be able to monitor some of that. I mean, you can't monitor everything, but having robust monitoring and logging and being able to do that analysis has helped us to deduce like where something has gone wrong. Has a vendor like mistakenly done something? Have they maliciously done something? Have we configured something wrong? And sometimes when you're in an on-prem environment, you're limited in the tools that you have to be able to do that analysis. But we've been able to build an ecosystem and a set of infrastructure considerations with StartingBlocks that has helped us with those investigations as we get more and more vendors in. So the security now, that umbrella, as it gets wider and wider, making sure that you have accommodations to be able to account for those like varied interactions is becoming more and more important. When in the past, it was more about incoming data and establishing a connection between maybe one or two source systems and then a handful of assessment vendors. But now you have places like South Carolina, which have multiple vendors pushing data in, multiple vendors with their own tooling pushing data in addition to what we're pushing in, several vendors consuming data and then also publishing data back. You just have this huge spider web of quote unquote security considerations that continues to get wider, and having cloud-based infrastructure gives you some advantages that you cannot replicate with a local installation of EdFi. And that's been another eye-opening experience for me in my last 3 years here at EA, is just be able to see the capabilities that we have with StartingBlocks that would have taken a long time to engineer with our local deployment like we had at IU. So not to say that you couldn't do it. Certainly there's way more experienced and skilled engineers out there than I ever could be and could recreate those same functionality on-prem, but the amount of time that you would spend developing that and deploying it is much better served in other areas, especially if you're an education organization looking to render services back to students and districts and teachers and educators.
So, like all of the products that EA produces and supports, StartingBlocks is open source. Can you, either of you, talk a little bit about what that means for the EdFi community and kind of how it reflects EA's mission?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit to that. Um, so EA is a nonprofit, so it is really we really like value providing low cost but also modern solutions for data analytics needs. Because we're a nonprofit, we're mission driven and not profit driven. So when we build out our services or tooling, it's kind of in our best interest as an organization who's in service of our mission to also provide these tooling to education agencies at low or really no cost, which would be the point of doing this as an open source code base. So our development team for StartingBlocks decided that we wanted to share our work with the EdFi and EdTech community because we felt we had some amount of built up experience and capability to provide and support this product over time, because it is something that we envision ourselves doing for years to come. And because we have that built up experience with EdFi, I think we've gotten to a point where we feel really comfortable sharing these artifacts with the greater community. And as we re-architect and update this over time, providing that back to the community as well. And I think also providing StartingBlocks as an open source code base, we by no means feel that we're like the absolute voice of truth on this or anything. And we definitely welcome folks to take that code base, alter it as they feel fit, and then share that back as well to make the solution kind of more robust for future users. So really driving community around something like this.
I have a non-technical view of this as well. And one of the things that we have seen over time is just a relative lack of transparency in the pricing around deploying robust cloud infrastructure for data products. There is certainly an incentive to do that because that is a place where you can build margin, but that also results in a little bit of fog of war when, let's say, a school district or a state agency is looking to just understand what it means from a pricing perspective and what you get when you spend a certain amount of money for cloud-based data infrastructure. And so our intention in making StartingBlocks fully open source was to lift some of that fog of war, is to make it so that if somebody is considering, even if they say we are primarily an Azure shop, well, having the ability to look at a product that is deployed in a competitor's cloud, but embodies the cloud engineering concepts and infrastructure attention to detail allows that organization to then say, okay, these are the things that we need to consider when we are picking a vendor, or we would like to adapt this same pattern and deploy it in our cloud, and then have those same concepts enumerated in a separate cloud environment, but they build on what we have already spent time engaging with, examining, making our own mistakes, making those mistakes public and viewable to show how we've learned lessons. That's all important. Whereas when we were looking around, even if you just look practically at the EdFi exchange to look at a AWS set of templates that somebody could use to do that evaluation, those templates hadn't been updated since 2021, I believe it was, or maybe even 2020. So pre-pandemic. And that to us was not an acceptable state for the community to be in, because if we are moving at the pace that we are with EdFi, if cloud providers are moving at the pace that we claim that they are, then having 5-year-old or 4-year-old technology is just not going to provide the customers and the clients of today's day and age to be able to have the right picture of what it takes to be able to run something like this at a production level in the cloud. So providing a fully open source production level set of CloudFormation templates that somebody can dig into, can understand the patterns, deploy it for themselves, make an approximation of if they have the right staffing levels to be able to deploy this themselves and maintain it themselves, or if they would rather choose a managed service provider. We are hoping for a more informed partner base, and we want to make sure that those that are out there that are considering EdFi have as many options on the table as they can, and don't feel like they only have a limited set of options to choose from when it comes to hosting EdFi. We truly want people to be fully aware of what they're getting into, and then also understand the ways in which this can be done at a production level. And I would say that that's one of my motivations for supporting this work and for supporting it on a long-term basis, is to make sure that that thread is always present, that somebody can always look at a choice to host EdFi in the cloud and be fully informed of what they're getting into, rather than having to cede that freedom to a choice that's locked behind a vendor.
That is a perfect segue to my last question, which is, are there any resources that folks can look at if they're interested in learning more about starting blocks, or maybe if they're interested in implementing starting blocks? Any tools or communities? We can put any links to these on our show notes.
Yeah, I think our main kind of like repository of knowledge is going to be our GitHub repository. The code base is out there, and you can feel free to fork it and do whatever you'd like with it. Hopefully within certain moral parameters, though. But in any case, it exists out there, and there are a few contributors there. If you want to reach out to any individuals, in particular, you can reach out via the emails for the contributors. I think there's a few. I think there's also a website that you could go to that is part of the education analytics website as well. That is for starting blocks. So those will be the main touch points for us.
Are there any agencies that you know of that have implemented starting blocks on their own at this point, or is everyone using starting blocks a current partner of EA as a managed service provider?
Yes to your second question. If you are an education agency out there who is using starting blocks currently, kind of on your own, please let me know. I would love to love to hear about that. We are relatively new in open sourcing our code base. It was probably open source like 3, 4 months ago. So I'm guessing that uptake will take a little bit of time and perhaps a little bit of prodding from our end too. Um, we have a few education agencies who, so most of our partners have our kind of services as a managed service provider. One of our partners, they're using it in kind of their own capacity, but with us as consultants, which is kind of a nice experiment to see, what other things have we not thought about that would be helpful for folks kind of trying to do it themselves, going their own. Um, but yeah, not so much uptake yet, but hopefully in the near future.
Well, this was very fortunate timing then, if it's only been open source for a few months.
Mhm.
This will give some good background for folks who might be just learning about it. So, um, I think we're about out of time. I do want to give the two of you an opportunity to add any information that you think is, vital for people to hear on this episode before we wrap up, if there's anything else.
I just want to say that I'm a representative of the people who have done some really good work to get us to this point and then continue to refine our code base moving forward. So the cloud engineering team at EA are just all stars. So I just want to say that I'm very thankful for them and also to be part of that team. And also you, Molly and Rosh, for having me on. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah, we hope to do kind of a series on the different layers of the EA product stack while we're ramping the podcast back up. So hopefully we will next hear from, the Stadium team and build on what you've both the foundation that you all lay in the cloud as well as the foundation that you've laid in this episode.
Yeah, thanks for your time, Eshara. And I will definitely echo. I am biased because for the better part of the last 3 years, I was leading the cloud engineering team. But what Eshara mentioned in terms of the attention to detail and the concern for even the most minute of security and infrastructure considerations is just a normal part of the day-to-day work of the Starting Blocks product team. And I can't say enough how impressed I am on a regular basis about the things that that team encounters ahead of what a partner in the field would encounter or responds to as soon as a partner ventures into uncharted territory. Uh, this has been just a privilege to be able to work with engineers of the highest quality. So I want to also ditto that shout out.
That's fantastic. And unfortunately, it's hard to get, 3 or 4 interviewees on the podcast at one time. So we're glad that you both can speak for the team to some extent. So I think we'll wrap it up there. And thank you both for the wealth of information. And of course, Rosh, you are a host, but also kind of a guest in this scenario. So I appreciate you playing both roles. And we will see our audience on the next episode. Thanks for listening.